Good morning, all. My name is Dr. Cristina Hernandez, and I'll be introducing Dr. Phyllis M. Barragán Goetz. Just some information about her. She received her PhD in American Studies from the University of Texas at Austin. She's an associate professor of history at Texas A&M San Antonio, where she teaches classes in Mexican American history, women's and gender history, Texas history, and the United States social and cultural history, and is the program coordinator for the Women's and Gender Studies program. Her book, Reading, Writing, and Revolution, Escuelitas and the Emergence of a Mexican American Identity in Texas, published by the University of Texas Press in 2020, won the National Association of Chicana Studies Book Award, the National Association for Chicana and Chicano Studies Tejas Focal Nonfiction Book Award, the Webb County Heritage Foundation Jim Parrish Award, and the Tejano Genealogical Society's Tejano Book Award. She is a 2021 recipient of the Mellon Emerging Faculty Award and the 2024 recipient of the Voces Oral History Collaborative Fellowship CMAS at UT Austin. She collaborated with the Jim Hogg County Historical Commission and the Museum Foundation of Hebbronville to get a Texas State historical marker for El Colegio Altamirano, 1897 through 1958, the most famous escuelita in Texas. Her article on the history of El Colegio Altamirano will be published in fall 2025. She's working on her second book project, The Borderlands of Inclusivity, Jovita Gonzalez and the Mexican American Civil Rights Movement, which has been supported by the American Council of Learned Societies, the Institute for Citizens and Scholars, and the National Endowment for the Humanities. It's a great honor to introduce you, Doctora.
Hi, thank you all so much for being here, and thank you for that lovely introduction. I'm so happy to be here at this Escuelita for Mas teachers. Dr. Saldana and I talked about how this Teachers Academy was similar to an Escuelita or was an Escuelita. So thank you so much to Dr. Saldana, to Dr. Gloria Gonzalez, and Cristina Solis for inviting me to be here today, for organizing, putting all the effort that went into organizing this, our session today, because it really is an honor and a privilege to share this virtual space with you all. So my talk is called, I'm going to share my screen very quickly here. Okay, so my talk is called The Feminist Legacy of Escuelitas, Education and Civil Rights in South Texas. And while Escuelitas and gender roles will be the focus of the talk, particularly in the second half, I also want to provide you all with some history of public education in Texas, because it is so closely tied to the history of Escuelitas. So I hope that presenting the information in this way is going to give you all a better grounding in Mexican American educational history, but also highlight why Escuelitas were so extraordinary. So the key questions that we're going to be tackling here today are: one, what were the origins? What are the origins of the public school system in Texas and educational segregation? Two, what were escuelitas and what impact did they have on their communities? And three, how did escuelitas provide space for ethnic Mexican women to take on leadership roles in their communities? So in 1870, the National Bureau of Education, so this is a few years, 5 years after the end of the Civil War, the National Bureau of Education could only locate one public school building in all of Texas and no state-supported schools. So Texas made a serious commitment to build more schools in the 1880s, a development that was initiated by the progressive education movement. And the first sign that this movement had arrived to Texas was with the 1884 School Reform Bill, which sought to create an educational bureaucracy for the state that consolidated schools, required teacher certification, and outlawed instruction in any other language other than English. So it took decades, several decades, for these reforms to yield any kind of a robust public school system. And a few decades later, so 1915, the state passed a compulsory school law, and another English-only bill was passed in 1918. So this is progressivism, right? But what did it actually look like? And how did it lay the groundwork for this myth that Mexicans don't value education, right? A myth that many of us are still combating today. So from the late 19th century to about 1910, superintendents across the state of Texas had to fill out an annual report and send it to the state superintendent of public instruction in Austin. So these were private documents that were exchanged between public school officials. And I should note that these superintendents, more often than not, they were not educators. They were county judges who were given extra duties and extra pay to oversee the schools of their county. So here's an example of one such superintendent, J.A. Bonnet. He was superintendent of Maverick County in 1897. And his report from that year states, I don't know how is there a volunteer who will unmute themselves and read this passage for us?
I got you. Myth making at center of Mexican American education history. The people are mostly Mexicans who do not put any great value in the education of their children, mostly being very poor. The legislature had an eye to patriotism when they formulated the present school laws and regulations. I beg to differ with you when it comes down to patriotism with these people who take all the benefits of our free school system and shout, Viva Mexico!
Thank you so much for that. I'm going to ask for one more volunteer for the next slide, just a heads up. So start thinking if you want to unmute yourselves. So let's talk about this for a minute. So Bonnet, right? J.A. Bonnet, this is 1897. There are not that many schools throughout South Texas in this era. And in fact, it's illegal to levy taxes in support of public education in this era because there was this widespread feeling of like, why are my tax dollars going to pay for the education of my neighbor's kid, right? I should only be responsible for my own. So oftentimes the state would donate land and donate materials to construct a school building, but it was up to the local communities to figure out how they were going to maintain the school, which meant that in a 9-month school year, only 4 or 5 months were actually free. And then the rest of the school year, when there was tuition that was being charged, right? So so Bonnet here, despite that context that I just gave you, he makes it abundantly clear that he thinks Mexicans don't value education. But also, what else can we pull from this document, right? I took it out, but I will tell you because for the sake of brevity. But in the handwritten part that you can see there, the cursive part, he talks about how he thinks teachers need to be paid less. And I will tell you in the 1920s, teachers made 55% of what the average wage earner of the state of Texas made. So teachers have always been overworked and underpaid. He also notes that many Mexican families live between 8 and 20 miles away from the nearest school. He states that many of these families are extremely poor, right? That's something that he states there. And interestingly, he talks about how attendance is low because they don't value education, but at the same time, they're taking advantage of a free public school system. So it's kind of like, which is it, right? Are they attending or are they not attending? But let's put this document in conversation with a report from 2 years later this is J.A. Bonnet, right? But the one from 2 years later is W.A. Bonnet, also of Maverick County, 1899. And in case you're wondering, yes, they were related, father and son. So an example of nepotism at its finest here. Let me see if I can. There we go. Okay, may I have another volunteer, please, who'll read this one?
I'll read it. About 80% of the children are of Mexican descent and their parents take no interest in educational matters. As a rule, they send their children to school only to keep from taking care of them.
Thank you so much for that. Okay, hold on. So let's take another critical approach to reading this document. Once again, like reading against the grain, right? So we can pull that W.A. Bonnet as well as J.A. Bonnet, his father, who was superintendent before him, lived in an area with a high Mexican and Mexican American population, a majority even. Both of them clearly believe Mexicans don't value education. If they send their children to school, that doesn't mean they value education. It means they want free childcare, right? An education that no matter what ethnic Mexicans did, if they sent their children to school, if they didn't send their children to school, they didn't value, there was nothing they could do to prove to the superintendents that they did value education, right? Because as I told you from the previous document, we learned from J.A. Bonnet, the father, that many families lived between 8 and 20 miles away from the nearest school. Many of them were really poor. I told you all how a lot of times schools weren't free for 9 months. They were only free for about 4 to 5 months. So there's not a lot of infrastructure. This is before the era of cars and highways. So if you live 20 miles away from your school, how are you going to get to school every day? So knowing all of this, right, what we can pull from these two documents is that there were families who still managed to get their children to school, overcoming all of those obstacles. And at the end of the day, the superintendent still said they just want free childcare, right? That's not even an indication that they value educating their children. And so something to keep in mind is that these two men that I'll collectively refer to as the Bonnets, they were progressives. This is what progressivism looked like, right? They were progressives because they were in favor of a public education system funded by the state government. But then we have to ask the question, public education for who? So I gave copies of these documents to Dr. Saldaña to put in the Google Drive for all of you teachers to use them if you'd like, because they demand that students use their critical thinking skills to read against the grain, right? And by that, I mean, you're not reading it and saying, oh, wow, well, I guess Mexicans in Maverick County just didn't value education, right? We're not doing that. We're pulling the details from these documents that we can to try to get a better understanding of the obstacles, the everyday experience, the negotiation that was taking place, the relationship that ethnic Mexicans had with education in the late 19th century. And then also to make connections between these different primary sources and wrestle with the contradictions embedded within them. So by the 1910s, the progressive education movement, its reforms and its strategies had blossomed into the educationally violent tactics of race-based segregation, English-only instruction, and an Anglo-centric and vocational curriculum for ethnic Mexicans, right? All of which reinforced and in a lot of ways justified the anti-Mexican violence of the early part of the 20th century. So if you're thinking about like, oh, this progressive education movement, it has such a benign, even like awesome, great sounding label, how does that turn into these things, right? Segregation and Anglo-centric curriculum and stuff. It's because the people behind the scenes, the people who were pushing this movement forward were people like the Bonnets, right? So in their minds, they were really progressive, but they were doing so with this tunnel vision that was really racist and xenophobic. So now we're going to talk a little bit about each of these things, segregation and the curriculum in particular. So educational segregation for ethnic Mexicans did not operate in the same way that it did for African Americans. The segregation of African Americans was written into the state constitution, which outlined a public school system for Black children and for white children. And Mexican Americans were legally considered white, and therefore they could not be segregated based on race. So pedagogical segregation then served as a cloak for race-based segregation. And what I mean by pedagogical segregation is the argument that Mexican children were segregated not because of their race, but because they couldn't speak English, or because they didn't know what it meant to be American, or all of the above, right? And so part of the argument for pedagogical segregation was that it was in the best interest of all people, of all the children, that Anglo children who were intellectually superior wouldn't get behind because they have to wait for Mexican kids to catch up. And Mexican kids who are intellectually inferior, they don't get an even bigger complex because they see how advanced the Anglo kids are, especially, right? But the reality is that no one was ever testing these kids. It was all based on skin color and last name. and things like that. So another factor so you have pedagogical segregation. Another factor in creating and maintaining educational segregation was residential segregation. So as David G. Garcia, he's a scholar at UCLA, one of the things he argues in his book called Strategies of Segregation, which I highly recommend, is that education and residential segregation were linked not by chance, but by design. So residential segregation is the use of racial covenants in particular to limit where people can live, right? And it aided school segregation because it forced the majority of the cities, and I'm referring to San Antonio specifically here, Mexican and Mexican American population to live on the west side and the south side, which gave rise to school segregation. So here's an example. This is a deed from 1912 from the Bexar County Clerk's Office for a neighborhood called Queensboro Place, which was kind of located in the north side of town. And you can see in the highlighted portion at the bottom, right, that the property was not allowed not to sell or lease to, nor allow the above described premises to be occupied by Negroes or Mexicans except as servants. So you have these racial covenants and deed restrictions that are limiting where people of color are allowed to purchase homes. And so what happens is you are able to construct, like the architects of the people who are executing these ideas, are able to construct neighborhoods that are largely Anglo, neighborhoods that are largely Mexican, neighborhoods that are largely Black. And so it's not just like, oh, these people all just want to live next to each other. And then you put a school in that neighborhood and suddenly, well, the school's mostly Mexican because they all want to live together. It's all deliberate and intentional, and it's been constructed that way. So these next few slides are going to highlight this constructed and deliberate nature of residential segregation. So the HOLC was a great, like a New Deal program from during the Great Depression, when Franklin Roosevelt was president, that sought to actually help banks make responsible decisions with their money in terms of who they were going to give mortgage loans to. So this is a map that the Homeowners Loan Corporation, that's the HOLC, this is a map that they made for San Antonio. And the agency made maps like this for cities all across the United States. And it was a map of racial concentrations, right? So you can see the red portions here in the map are labeled Mexican, the Black portions are labeled African American, and then the white portions here, the northern part of the city, and then a pocket on the south side is labeled white. So then this map is a companion to the previous map, right? And this is grades of security. So if somebody coming from the pink area is going into your bank and trying to request a mortgage loan, just know that that's a hazardous area for you to be giving that money to or lending that money to. And there's a high chance, this is what the HOLC was saying, there's a high chance that you're not going to get your loan back, which makes the bank feel like, oh, well, we can't lend money to these people to buy mortgages, right? The yellow is indefinite decline. Purple is still desirable, but the light blue is the best. And so you'll see that, you know, from the racial concentrations, right? The light blue here, it's all highly white. So all the pink areas were basically where people of color lived. And so here's a photo. I don't know how many of you are familiar with the Monte Vista neighborhood, which is an old historic district in San Antonio. It's a beautiful neighborhood. And so this is an aerial view of that neighborhood from 1926, right? And you'll see clearly the roads are paved. There's lots of trees. There's order, right? The streets are laid out into a grid. And even from this aerial view, you can get a sense of the size of the homes. A number of these homes have historical markers today. They were designed by famous architects of their time, and they all look huge. So this is 1926. And these are images. So it's, again, from a New Deal program called the Farm Security Administration. The purpose of that program was to bring attention to the plight of people suffering in rural areas. And so one of the things that the head of the Farm Security Administration did was hire professional photographers. This was back in the day when a camera was big and heavy, and you had glass negatives, and it was a cumbersome thing. But these professional photographers traveled to the United States and took pictures of everything that they saw. And so in 1939, Russell Lee, he came through San Antonio and he took a number of photos of the Mexican district. Now, all of these photos are available for free at the Library of Congress website. They are incredible. There's like over 100,000 photos or something like that. But Yale University has created a website, and I did share this link with Dr. Saldana, created a website called Photogrammer that pulls from the Library of Congress database and organizes these photos by county. So you could click on Bexar County or Webb County or whatever on the map, and you'll be able to see all the photos that were taken in that area. So these are photos that Russell Lee took in 1939. So this is 13 years after that Monte Vista aerial photo that I just showed you. 1939 of the Mexican district. And this is not, these photos were not taken on the outskirts of town or sort of in the middle of nowhere. These photos are actually not even that far. The location of this Mexican district was not even that far from where Monte Vista is. But you can see there's a community outhouse here. So probably a lot of these homes don't have running water, much less a bathroom or indoor plumbing. And then there's no pavement here. A lot of these homes were made by the people themselves with whatever materials that they could find. And there's, I think Russell Lee took about 400 photos. So if any of you are interested in seeing more, by all means, check out that Photogrammer site. I use it in my classroom all the time. But let's shift gears now and talk and have an example of what that curriculum. So when we say an Americanization, vocational or industrial centered curriculum for children of color, what exactly does that mean? So another primary source here, also taken from the Library of Congress website, and I did share this link with Dr. Saldana. It's an instructional manual called Americanization Through Homemaking by Pearl Ellis. It was published in 1929. Now, the preface states that public school is the greatest factor in the process of assimilating Mexicans. And so note the photo and the caption found in this book, right? Amelia, a Mexican girl of average intelligence and pleasing personality. And it speaks to this prevalence of the belief that Mexican children, they weren't smart, but they were docile enough to be shaped as future workers, right? And I highlighted the portion where it says our main hope lies with the rising generation, right? The public school is the greatest factor in this development, the development of Americanizing Mexicans. So chapter 1 is about teaching Mexican girls how to sew. And the opening sentence says, right, Mexican girls are very fond of sewing. And it continues, since only about 5% of Mexican girls who graduate from the 8th grade enter the high school, their ability as seamstresses must be developed in the elementary schools. For this reason, it's best to begin instruction in sewing as early as possible, the 3rd year, that's 3rd grade at the least. And if the girl is 12 and in the 1st grade, she should have sewing since she only has a few more years of schooling, right? So the author clearly believes that vocational industrial training should begin earlier than high school or middle school. In fact, it should be the main focus of elementary education when students are supposed to be learning how to read and write and all of those things. And she's also making the argument that doing so is in the best interest of the child, right? Because again, they're not going to go to school beyond the 4th or the 5th grade. And look at this photo that accompanies the text. Like clearly these children don't look happy. So I'm not really sure what they were thinking about putting this picture in there. Chapter 2 is about food. And the text gives further insight into why many educators and policymakers believed that a vocational curriculum was in the best interest of the children, right? She says, and this is the highlighted portion, it's not expected that the average Mexican girl in our elementary school can comprehend chemical terms as applied to household science, right? So let's teach her she goes on to say, a general knowledge of foods. And so again, reinforcing this idea that Mexican girls are not very smart, but also taking a look at the photo and putting it in conversation with the text that we just read, right? They don't look like they're a part of a curriculum that's teaching them how to take care of their own homes because they're wearing uniforms. So these are children, probably elementary school children, wearing uniforms. So they are clearly being trained to work in wealthy families' homes. And then I want to close this portion of the talk with a photo of what one of these Mexican ward schools looks like. So this is a photo from 1946 from Mathis, Texas. It was taken by Dr. George I. Sanchez, who was a professor at UT Austin. And this is the caption that Dr. Sanchez wrote: the typical dilapidated, inadequate, rotting old shack, which is one of the mainstays of the Mexican ward school in Mathis. Notice rotting lumber, no screens on windows, no screen doors, improper lighting, no fly proofing or rat proofing. Inside it is dark, crowded, and generally of an uninviting appearance. He took many more photos, Dr. Sanchez did in 1946. All of this went into a report that he co-wrote. I tried to find a copy of it online at UT Austin. The Benson Library used to have a copy of it online, but it's not there anymore. So I was hoping to share that with you all. But I did, however, share a link with all the other photos that he took during this session when he was driving around to 10 different school districts and then photographing what he saw. And then finally, I shared also with Dr. Saldana an excerpt from Paul S. Taylor's 1934 book, An American Mexican Frontier. And if you read those few pages, it'll also give you some insight into how segregation, the curriculum, especially history and the history of the Alamo and the way that was taught, coupled with low quality facilities, impacted the everyday lives of ethnic Mexican children. So now this is the second portion of the talk where we're going to focus on how education was also used as a tool that Mexican Americans were used to, like a vehicle for them to be able to assert agency. Before we jump into escuelitas, I do want to highlight the fact that there were numerous Mexican American women who went to school to become public school teachers and to try to help and support their community in that way. This is a photo from Arizona's Tempe Normal School, which is like a teacher certification program, where over 60 Mexican American teachers graduated from between 1885 and 1936. This photo is from 1908. If you want more information, I highly recommend Laura Munoz's new book called Desert Dreams, which focuses on a lot of these teachers in Arizona. It was just published, was it last year? I think it's a very recent book. Which brings us to escuelitas. So well before the rise of the public school system in the 1880s, escuelitas existed in nearly every settlement across South Texas, as one Hidalgo County superintendent wrote. And these little schools thrived on ranches and in urban spaces alike. So before the expansion, remember I told you the public school system in Texas didn't really start expanding in earnest until the 1880s and 1890s. But even before then, escuelitas provided their communities with a way to educate their children. In the escuelitas, students learned Spanish literacy, literature, math, science, arts and crafts, and even sometimes PE, physical education. After the proliferation of public education, the type of escuelita often dictated the curriculum, but Spanish was always the language of instruction, even into the 1950s. So like informal escuelitas, for example, such as those that operated in a neighborhood woman's living room, might focus on Spanish literacy and math, while you had more formal ones where members of the community would pool their resources, construct a building, hire a teacher, charge tuition. Those offered a much more complete curriculum. And formal escuelitas, Colegio Altamirano, which I'm going to talk more about at the end of this talk. That'll be the last thing I talk about. So Colegio Altamirano was really the most famous escuelita, and it was very much a formal escuelita. It was the most famous one in the state. It operated during the day, and it replaced the school system through the 6th grade. So it went through from first to 6th grade. And so not only did escuelitas provide their communities with access to educational opportunities before the public school system had even taken root, they also continued to teach their students about their native culture and language for decades after segregation was a cornerstone of public education. So the first I want to focus on, but before we get to Colegio Altamirano, I want to talk about Laredo, which has a very strong and long escuelita history. And I want to focus on 3 ethnic Mexican women in Laredo who established their own escuelitas between 1910 and 1920, Jovita Idar, Maria Renteria, and Leonor Villegas de Magnon. So in September of 1911, the Idar family, which was a prominent family in Laredo, published their own Spanish language newspaper called La Crónica. So this family also hosted El Primer Congreso Mexicanista, or the First Mexican Congress, to discuss the social, economic, and political discrimination against ethnic Mexicans in Texas. And so during this conference, Texas Mexican women also organized themselves into their own charitable group called La Liga Femenil Mexicanista, the Mexican Women's League. And their main objective was the education of Texas Mexican children. And these women believed that the widespread poverty and illiteracy among their community's children were the most pressing problems for ethnic Mexicans in the city. And so they founded their own escuelitas as a way to deal with the issues of their time. And so Jovita Idar, you'll see she was voted president of La Liga. She was born in that city in Laredo in 1885. Her family was the organizers of this Mexican Congress. They were the publishers of La Crónica. And she published many articles in her family's newspaper, often under pen names. She herself earned a teaching certificate in 1903. She taught in a public school in a small rural town for a few years before she moved back home. And so as a member of an intellectual family and as president of La Liga, she wrote multiple articles on the state of education for Mexican children. Now, in August 1911, she published an article called La Niñez Mexicana in Texas, or the Mexican Children of Texas, in which she wrote, may I have another volunteer for someone to read this passage?
I'll go ahead. We, the parents of our Mexican children in Texas, should unite to cover the costs that a school requires. Mexican children in Texas need education. Neither our government in Mexico nor the United States government can do anything for them. And we have no other recourse than to do it ourselves in exchange for no longer being dismissed by the foreigners that surround us.
Thank you so much. So in this passage right here, Idar is positioning escuelitas as a solution to the pressing issues for her family, believing that with communal support, right, everybody's got to chip in for this, that these little schools could alleviate the widespread poverty and also tumultuous race relations. So Jovita Idar is the 9th woman, some of you may already know this, the 9th woman to appear on the quarter as part of the American Women Quarters program. Her quarter was released, I think, a couple of years ago, and this photo was the model for it. The second woman I want to focus on also lived in Laredo between 1910 and 1920 is Maria Renteria, who was 18 in 1911, so a young woman. She was elected treasurer of La Liga. She graduated from Mexico City's Normal School for Women, again, that's a teaching program, and advertised her escuelita en La Crónica, stating that she taught young women how to read and write in Spanish, as well as arts and crafts. But her published writings in the newspaper, in La Crónica, give us more insight into the possible nature of her curriculum beyond these arts and crafts. So 1 month after the founding of La Liga, Renteria shared her research on Mexican women's history with her fellow Liga members, and then she published an article based on this research in La Crónica the following week. So her article focused on 2 women who helped Mexico win its independence from Spain. And here's another excerpt. And may I have another volunteer, please?
I can read. Oh, go ahead. Go ahead. In studying history, we find beautiful examples of mothers who sacrificed themselves for their children, wives who braved thousands of dangers to save their husbands and enhance their homeland, and daughters who feared nothing and challenged everything to achieve the happiness of their parents and the honor and glory of their country.
Thank you so much. And so Renteria's article not only combats stereotypes of Mexican women, but also it's an early, very early form of women's history because it positions women as active agents and it acknowledges the value of their labor as mothers, as soldiers, and as everything in between. And so by inserting women's roles into Mexico's founding history during a time when the Mexican Revolution had only begun, she was making a statement about the various roles that women could play in their community's present and future. And by sharing her research with her fellow teachers, she helped all of the women of La Liga understand that by taking on the role of being a teacher, of educating Laredo's children in a time when no one else was going to do that work, they were carrying out their own revolutionary act. Now, another one of Idar's friends and colleagues was Leonor Villegas de Magnon, who is credited with opening Laredo's first kindergarten around 1904. And she had 14 students when she opened her escuelita. And around that, that same year, the Mexican Revolution was already underway. And after the Second Battle of Nuevo Laredo in 1914, Magnon and many of her friends and colleagues, one of which was Jovita Idar, they brought, after the battle ended, they crossed the river. They brought many of the wounded constitutionalist soldiers. They dragged them across the river, took them into Laredo, and then Magnon turned her home and her school into a makeshift hospital. And so she has this passage in her autobiography, which I also highly recommend. It's called The Rebel. She has this passage where her students showed up to school and there were all these wounded soldiers on their desks, and their desks were served as makeshift hospital beds, and that the children actually helped her take care of these wounded soldiers. And so while Magnon's students had a completely different experience than most children, her escuelita became a meeting ground for the current hardships their communities faced and the potential, even the hope for better days ahead. The next escuelita I want to discuss, as promised, was located in Hebronville. And Hebronville, it's 2.5 hours really, directly south of San Antonio. It's highlighted on this map. So, El Colegio Altamirano, as I said earlier, was the most famous escuelita in Texas. It opened in 1897 in Hebronville, which at the time was located in Duval County. And so 1895, this is just a couple of years before Colegio opens. Duval County was comprised of about 1,800 square miles of land, and it had 18 public schools in the entire county, which might sound like, 18, that's kind of a lot. That's one school every 100 square miles. And of those 18 schools, only one of them was a high school, and none of them were graded. So Hebronville didn't actually get its first public school until 1921. So the fact, when El Colegio opens in 1897, it's the only school in town. It's the only school in the region. And then there is a Catholic church in Hebronville that opens in the 1890s, and they open a Catholic school in 1911. So Colegio Altamirano is actually the only school until the parochial school opens. And then at that point, there are 2 schools. So in the face of the utter lack of educational opportunities, you have 6 members of the ethnic Mexican community in Hebronville. They pool their resources, they donate land, they donate materials, donate money, donate their physical labor. They build their own schoolhouse, and then they hire a teacher from Mexico. Actually, the guy they end up hiring is this guy here, Rosendo Barrera Guerra, and he's the brother of one of the founders. So they bring him from Mier, Mexico, is where the family's from, and then they hire him to be the first headmaster. And so this is the first photo. I think that's probably available. It opened in 1897, and this is a photo from the 1898-1899 school year. You see Rosendo Barragán here, and then note the flags, right? This is a Mexican flag, this is an American flag, and all the children are dressed up in their Sunday best, as you would say. This is another photo from Colegio Altamirano. This is 1911. And the teacher that you see seated here in front of the chalkboard, her name was Emilia Davila. She was born in 1885 in Saltillo, Coahuila. She was a graduate of the Teachers College there. She taught at El Colegio from 1910 to 1916, and then again from 1930 to 1955. In the intervening years, she taught in the public school system in Saltillo, where she helped organize teachers into a union. And during the early part of her teaching career, and this context I'm about to give you goes for Davila, but also for Jovetilidad, Leonor Villegas de Magnon, and Maria Renteria. So during this era, because all of these women are teaching at the same time, the teaching profession is going through a transformation in Mexico and in South Texas. It's becoming professionalized. And one of the things that I argue in my work is that these women teachers, these ethnic Mexican women teachers, they embody the modern women of the borderlands, right? They're educated, they're independent, they're ambitious. They were community and intellectual leaders. So you see this with all these women, right? And countless others that I'm sure we don't know about yet, or we might never learn about them. So in this photo, Davila is about 26, and every living former student of El Colegio studied with her. So Davila taught 6 different grades in multiple subjects. The only textbook that she used was a small book of poems. She created many of the materials that the students needed. She created them herself. Students took their oral exams in front of large crowds at school artistic and literary festivals at the end of each semester. Multiple former students of Davila still have report cards and tuition receipts, which tells us the subjects she taught, as well as how much families paid to send their children. So I don't know how well you can see the report card there that's on the bottom part of the screen. That's from the 1930s and 1940s, but we can see she taught Spanish, math, science, geography, Mexican history, drawing, calligraphy, singing, exercise, manual trades, and behavior and conduct. And in 1939, families paid $1 a month, which equates to about $22.80 today. Her former students vividly remember her passionate lectures on Mexican history, rigorous math lessons, and her very high expectations for behavior. So she was really strict. She didn't hesitate to spank her students. She even slapped some of them when she caught them cursing. Students also remember her expectations for keeping themselves and their environment clean. And there were many ways that Davila was a leader in her community beyond the work she did as a teacher. She advocated for a public library years before the Jim Hogg County Public Library opened in 1936. After it opened, she regularly donated Spanish language reading materials for children and adults. In the early 1940s, she hosted Spanish story time during National Book Week at the library. In this era, she also organized her students to plant and maintain a garden in the town's plaza. And current residents of Hebronville believe that the trees in the plaza today, they're like these very large, well-developed trees. They think that they may be the same ones that she planted. And at the time, the Hebronville librarian wrote and published in an article that Davila was, quote, one of the most civic-minded residents of this town. Beyond her work as a teacher, she was also a social worker. In the late 1930s, cases of smallpox increased in Hebronville and in the area. And one former student remembers that in the early 1940s, she herself had that little injection gun, and she herself administered smallpox vaccinations to all her students in the class. And during Christmas, she would cut down a salt cedar tree, which is actually an invasive species and looks nothing like a Christmas tree, by the way. But she would cut down this salt cedar tree and put it up in the classroom, decorate it, and then provided enough presents underneath the tree for every student in her class. Another student remembers that she would draw names, and then when it was your turn, you could go up and pick a gift from underneath the tree. So in 2024, just last year, I had really, and I can't overstate this, great privilege to receive the Voces Oral History Collaborative Fellowship from the for Mexican American Studies and the Voces Oral History Center at UT Austin. So we conducted 14 oral history interviews with former students of El Colegio Altamirano and 2 interviews with former students of the Catholic school across the street. And the fellowship provided all the resources for us to do this work. And these interviews provided so much rich information about the daily routines of the school and the impact Emilia Davila had on her students' lives. All of the former students studied with Davila between the 1930s and the 1950s, which is when she retired. And many of the historic newspaper articles about El Colegio stopped in the 1930s. So what was incredible for me as a researcher was that these interviews pick up where the written record left off. These interviews are part of the Voces Oral History collection at the Benson Latin American Library at UT. And the next couple of slides are going to come from these interviews. And a lot of the information that I just shared with you all about Emilia Davila also came from the interviews, by the way. So one interviewee, Antonio Ramos Gonzalez, interviewed by Dr. Valerie Martinez, he said in his interview, everything was from pure respect. You had to keep yourself clean too. That is what I liked about her. You were poor, whatever clothes, but clean. La Prensa reported that Davila was a true intellectual mother of the children of Hebronville, not only because she was an excellent teacher, but because of the many ways she contributed to the community and because of the many ways that she impacted her students' lives, even just beyond teaching them like the academics. So the next slide is a clip of an interview from Beatriz Barrera Gonzalez, and I had the great honor of being able to interview her. She's 93 years old. She's incredible. She attended El Colegio for 3 years in the late 1930s and the 1940s. And this clip hopefully illustrates the strong impression that Davila's lessons had on her.
We're not hearing her volume.
Oh, I'm sorry, you can't hear her?
No, when you, I think if you share, there should be an audio.
I'm sorry, I'm not sure. I can.
Perhaps you could reshare your screen or your presentation and just make sure you click the share sound with it.
Yes.
Oh. Oh, 1 second. And it's in Canva that would say share sound?
In the Zoom.
In the Zoom, yes.
Oh, you guys are amazing. Thank you. Okay, let me get back to that.
Doctora, you have about I want to say 10 minutes left for the presentation, but if we want to leave room for questions, maybe like 5? I don't know. It's up to you.
Oh, perfect. This clip is only a minute and it's our last.
Okay.
Okay,
awesome.
Still no sound.
There's still no sound?
No.
I'm sorry, did you all say there's still no sound?
There's no sound.
No sound.
Okay, yeah, I'm not sure why then, because I did click on for the Zoom, I did click on the share sound. Yeah, so Dr. Saldana, I am going to share this with you, and then if you would like to 1 second. Okay, so I just shared the design with Dr. Saldana, and then if she's able to access it and just play that last link, it's one of the last slides of the thing, then we can listen to it. But I'm happy to get started with like the questions. I'll just briefly summarize. So in this interview clip, Beatriz talked about a particular lesson that Emilia Davila gave about marine life, that she was a small child living in this rural, unincorporated town in South Texas. She'd never seen a river. She'd never seen a sea. She'd never seen the ocean. And Emilia Davila would give science lessons and about the whales and about mammals and how it was in a lot of ways life-changing. And even now, I mean, it was life-changing for her to think about a world beyond her small town where she lived. And even now, at the age of 93, she still vividly remembers, like that's one of the memories that has stayed with her all of these years, all of these decades, is that biology lesson on the whales. But I'm happy to take questions or comments if anybody has anything they want to say or ask me about.
And y'all are welcome to unmute.
Dr. Goetz, I wanted to say thank you for your presentation. I've used your lecture, one that you gave over the years in my MOS class, and they're very influential to my students. There's different types or different times in my unit. I put in the chat if anybody here is a first-time educator, when to put this in their curriculum. Transitionary period between the Revolutionary War, Mexican Revolution, sorry, and World War One, when I cover LULAC, or even the walkouts whenever I look at the change over time and how history has evolved in regards to education. But I love this lecture for my students. I go a little quicker for them because they want to get to the movie if it's the walkout, or if I want to really hit LULAC. But for those educators out there, that's a good spot to kind of put this in. One more thing, and I'll mute myself. I also compare the, I use San Antonio v. Rodriguez. I kind of look at educational inequities starting in the past and then compare it to San Antonio.
Thank you so much, Juan, right? Thank you so much for sharing that. And thank you so much for using my work in your classroom. That's amazing. And yeah, San Antonio versus Rodriguez is an incredible, it's a landmark case, and it's heartbreaking because how many of you in here think that education is a constitutional right? It's not. I mean, I'm not saying I don't think it is, but according to this Supreme Court case, it's actually not. It's after the student walkouts in the late 1960s, and then you had parents in the Edgewood district, which is in the south side of San Antonio, basically draw inspiration from their children who had walked out. And so the parents organized themselves. They sue over the inadequate and like the discriminatory funding approach to funding public education in the state of Texas, saying that, you know, Alamo Heights district, which is a wealthy district, gets, and I forget the exact numbers, but it's like $400, $500 per student. The Edgewood district gets like $4 or something like that per student. And so initially they win the case, but then when it goes to the Supreme Court on appeal, the Supreme Court overturns the previous court case. It is like, yeah, we feel for you guys. This is terrible, but it's not an infringement on your constitutional rights. So Texas, you guys need to fix this. There's nothing, it's out of our hands. There's nothing that we can do about it. And I believe the Library of Congress also has some more information about that case with some resources online that you all should be able to access. But does anyone else have any other questions or comments? Anything else they want to discuss?
I can chime in. Hi, Dr. Barragán. My name is Jonathan, and thank you so much for your talk. I'm actually based in Atlanta, Georgia. I'm from the Southeast, and your work was really foundational in founding our escuelitas in Atlanta, where we're teaching ethnic studies, bilingual ethnic studies to Latino students in the Buford Highway community, which is a historic immigrant community in Atlanta. But we don't have the same legacies and infrastructure of Mexican American Latino organizing in the Southeast as you do in Texas. And so I just want to thank you so much for being one of the reasons with your work, along with the Escuelitas teachers also, of course, for helping us learn to build infrastructure that doesn't exist for this kind of work in Atlanta, Georgia, and in the Southeast. So thank you. But I'm wondering too, thinking about the moment that we're in currently, where we're seeing ethnic studies under attack, when we're seeing the disintegration of public schools, what are some lessons from the escuelitas back then that you think can apply to our current moment that we're living in now, to fight for Mexican American studies, ethnic studies, but also for community-based education?
Yeah, Jonathan, first, I just want to say thank you so much for sharing that with me at the beginning of your comment. I can't even begin to tell you how much that means to me. And if I'm always happy to like zoom into one of your meetings, if that would be helpful. Just if so, like, please send me an email. But I think there's so much that our community can learn from Escuelita, the history of Escuelitas. And I think we are living an example right now. And I mean that literally, right? Like I had a conversation with Dr. Salania before about how the Teachers Academy that meets every year, and this is the 10th anniversary, right, Dr. Salania, is like an escuelita. I mean, it's a virtual one, right? It's a 21st century escuelita. And I think things like this, things that you mentioned, that maybe you guys don't have the same history as people who are trying to do this work in Texas or other parts of the Southwest, but you're making it as you go, right? Like you are actively building this legacy that generations from now are going to point back to the work that you and your colleagues are doing. And I think what we're doing right now is it, right? The two biggest takeaways, I think, from Escuelita history is one, how to approach the curriculum so that you have an Anglo-centric curriculum historically and even presently a lot of times. But then you have the curriculum of the Escuelitas, which was very Mexican-centric, right? Well, how do you incorporate the two? How do you bring those two together? And as amazing as Mexican American studies is as a field, as a discipline, and as necessary as it is, there also needs to be changes in what's considered the traditional or master narrative of US history and US literature studies, right? It's not enough to just have the traditional American-centric, Anglo-centric historical narrative and say, oh, okay, well, if you want to learn anything about anybody else, then you have to take these extra classes. It belongs in both places, right? These narratives belong in both places. Like, we need a more integrated curriculum in regular history classes, but we also need these decolonized spaces, which is what Mexican American studies classes provide, right? So I think when you look at the history of Escuelitas and you're able to see these connections and these relationships within this larger idea of what a curriculum is and what we should be fighting for, I think Escuelita history provides us with the guide to move forward for that. But then the second thing that I want to highlight about Escuelita history is the power of the communities to organize themselves to overcome the obstacles that they face in terms of education, right? Because education's a double-edged sword. Like, it is absolutely a tool for oppression. When you look at the history of public education, in the United States, and for our purposes today in Texas and in other areas of the Southwest. Absolutely, right? Look at that handbook from 1929 about the way it talks about, the way it describes, the way it even the photographic evidence that it's trying to provide about these Mexican children and what they're capable or incapable of learning. Does that make sense? Right? So we're fighting against all of that. And so I think Escuelita history then, again, the curriculum, but then also the power of communities. I hope that answers your question, but if not, please let me know.
Thank you, and I
I
look
think
forward.
Jody has a question.
Can you hear me okay?
Yes, I hear you great.
Okay. I just wanted to say thank you so much. I'm a retired state park ranger out of West Texas. And several years ago, I got asked to join the National Park Conservation Association as we were continuing our efforts to make the Blackwell School of Marfa the National Historic Site, which we succeeded in. And it was just a real honor to be able to meet some of the former students there. And I felt like the resident expert on the council. But after taking Dr. Saldana's class on educational legacies this past semester and reading your book, it really gave me so much insight into how these schools came to be, and with the experiences of students there, and helped me put into perspective some of the stories that I was hearing firsthand from the former students. And not only that, but I got to understand what my parents and my grandparents went through when they migrated to South Texas during the Mexican Revolution, and how they struggled to put money together as communities or individually to put their children to school, to know, because they knew how important it was. And your book absolutely was instrumental in helping me just geometrically expand my understanding of what their circumstances and their journeys were like. And I just want to thank you so much for that. And I will definitely be using that as a reference for when I do my writings about my family history. And I just want to thank you so much for that.
Thank you so much for sharing. Thank you so much for that. And thank you so much for the work that you did with the Blackwell School.
Denise Rostos?
Hi, good morning, everybody. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. I just wanted to point out two things that I got from your presentation. While I'm not a direct MAS educator, I do work in school districts here in San Antonio, and I advocate as much as I can through the families, educating my family's parents. I work special education, so there's a lot of lack of knowledge of their students' rights. And having worked in Edgewood ISD for about 10 years and now working at Northside ISD, I can still see some of the differences of lack of funding, lack of training for the specialists. I'm currently a brailleist for the visually impaired, but at the time I was a paraprofessional and there was no training available for me because of the funding. And even that, like seeing Edgewood families and Edgewood parents and how humble and thankful they were for, taking care of their children, educating their children, and moving over to Northside ISD, which is the biggest district in San Antonio, and the entitlement that I see in this side, like the north side of town versus Edgewood, it's like I can't believe it sometimes, because it is literally like the entitlement of, you owe us this, versus, Edgewood, that it's so thankful for the work we do. And sometimes us as educators, the resources come from us. Like I had to educate myself to be able to transfer this information to my student when I was there. So it's sad to see that it's still going on, where the lack of funds, you can see the difference in the two districts. And then the other thing I took in from your presentation is the we're losing a lot of time when it comes to interviewing our elders. They have such a wealth of knowledge that, like there's so much we can document and so much we can do and learn from them. I think it would be like, like very valuable as teachers to have your students conduct these interviews, because not only are you bonding with the different generations, and making those connections, but also, they're learning all these things with technology, but also listening to storytellers, the real original storytellers of our time, where it's not, you know, straight from their mouth, their lived experiences. I think it's such an important part of being in this mass community and educating and helping each other. And these stories are very valuable, in my opinion. And I do appreciate your presentation. And I'm going to go look at all these pictures because I am a, you know, photo enthusiast. So thank you for sharing all that information. I appreciate your work very much.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. I really appreciate your comment. And yes, and the Voices Oral History Center's website, I believe does have some information about how to conduct oral histories, and certainly information you all could share with your students if you were so inclined to have them interview elders in their families. Because yes, absolutely, a million percent yes.
I think some people had their hands up, right?
Yes, Yolanda?
Hi, good morning, everyone. I was making a lot of connections during your presentation. I think even emotional to one point, my daughter was like, "What's wrong with you?" You know, when you were talking about like the language and how students are not able to learn, like here I am, 15 years in education and working up here in Pflugerville ISD. I had the opportunity as an instructional coach to sit in on ELA meetings, and there was one, I will never forget this. It's changed what I've done with my career. She came in and teased and joked and mocked a student who's like, clearly this kid had used ChatGPT to try to give me the answer. What Spanish speaking kid uses this language? And she went on to read what the kid had, what she thought used ChatGPT. And I said, did it ever occur to you that this is how the student speaks in their native language and they Google translated it? And so this is how they actually speak. Like they use vocabulary that is higher than the vocabulary our students use each and every day. That was one experience. Second is a lot of teachers, well, they can't. And to me, every time I hear a teacher as an instructional coach or even outside of that role, every time they say they can't, all I hear is the teacher can't. Like you don't know how to bridge the gap for our kids. And so that's thrusted me into going back into the classroom, into the newcomer academy for our students, because I do see that they indeed have all of that background knowledge, and the only thing that they have currently that keeps them to excelling in our class is the language barrier. And I'm fighting for my students to be able to, in my perspective, to help them bridge that gap so that they're not left behind. And secondly, to piggyback off of the comment on interviews, I was privileged enough to have Dr. Manuel Medrano as my Mexican American Studies professor several years ago. And one of the things that he instilled on us was the concept of interviews. And for as long as I've been teaching, at the beginning of the school year, I tell my students, your year-long project is to interview the eldest living relative in your house. Maestra, pero es que viven en Mexico. I know that you call now here we are 15 years later, you can call them or use WhatsApp or whatever. There's no excuse. And every single one of my students at the end of the year is required to have either a recorded video or audio recording of them interviewing their eldest living relatives, or preferably their grandparents, and if they can do it together. And all of them hate it, but at the end of the year are so appreciative because they find out things about their family and their history that they never knew. And here's Miss Flores making them interview their grandparents, and they all love it. They love it so much. And so if anyone wants, I'll actually put it inside of the drive, just like the 10 questions that I make them ask. Some of them are sensitive, and I tell my students, you have to be conscious and aware, read the room. If they can't answer it because it's clearly hard for them to share, then you say, okay, let's move on to the next question. But it is something that I highly encourage everyone to do, because that is a history. I tell them no history is more important than your own history. Know where you come from. Anyway, thank you for listening.
Thank you for that. That's beautiful. Yolanda, I'd love to see that assignment that you created. That sounds incredible. Michael Cortinas?
Oh, good morning.
Manuel Medrano.
I'm sorry, what?
Dr. Manuel Medrano at UTB-TSC.
Yes. I studied. He was a great professor. I just wanted to just mention that uh, many of the things we discussed here this morning are similar to things I grew up hearing from my mother and her siblings, who all attended a one-room schoolhouse on the King Ranch during the first part of the 20th century. It was a one-room schoolhouse from first grade to eighth grade, everyone in the same room, being taught by the same teacher at the same time. And they have wonderful stories, childhood recollections that they share and impart on me and my siblings. And I just wanted to share that. I was wondering how did how was there any difference between the schoolhouses, the escuelitas on the private ranches as opposed to in the public schools?
Oh, that's a great question. Yeah, that's a great question. A lot of schools on the ranches could be considered an escuelita. And a lot of times, if a ranch that was pretty established, like the King Ranch, for example, which is kind of the biggest ranch in Texas, schools that would start out as an escuelita over time would be adopted into the public school system, especially in this period of the 1880s, 1890s, early 1900s, when the public school system is really trying to expand. And of course, they're hindered by their own racism and prejudice. And so a lot of times what they'll do is if there's already an established school on a ranch, then they would kind of adopt it, and that would become it would be considered a public school after a certain period of time.
Thank you. That would be our last question. Sorry. Just wanted to say we're out of time.
Okay.
Oh,
thank you.
Of course. Yeah. Thank you all so much. And I'm going to send the clip of Beatriz Gonzalez. It's like a minute, maybe a minute and 20 seconds or something. And it's just a clip of a 2-hour. I interviewed her for 2 hours, and that's just like a minute and a half clip. But I'll send it to Dr. Saldana, and she can put the clip into the Google Drive so that you all can watch it. But thank you all so much again for the invitation and for being such an incredible audience. And thank you to everyone who volunteered to help read through the slides.